So we're now continuing our verse-by-verse study through the Bible. We're in Genesis chapter 30, and we just finished Genesis chapter 29, and that's where the deceiver, Jacob, who had treated his father and his brother so terribly, man, he reaped what he sowed. He wound up having his wife that he had worked for 7 years, Rachel. The father-in-law substituted the older sister, Leah, on the wedding night, and he wound up with the wrong wife, and he had to work an extra 7 years to get Rachel. The end of chapter 29 is talking about the confusion, the strife that came between them. And one of the points that I made in this last chapter was talking about that you reap what you sow. And I tell you, this is just a classic example of this, and this is a motivation for me to live a godly life and to not lie and deceive and do those things, because you will reap what you sow, and it's illustrated in Jacob's life. So that's what we covered in the 29th chapter. Here in the 30th chapter, it says in verse 1, "And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die." You know, this is so radical. I understand that having children was more important to women in those days, actually, than it is nowadays, because a woman didn't have the same opportunities that women have today. Basically, they were wives, and they bore children, and they were the ones that helped establish the family and do things like that, and they didn't have a life outside of the family. And so I can understand that this was really critical, but for her to come to Jacob and say, "Give me children or else I die." Look at the next verse. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld thee from the fruit of thy womb?" She was totally irrational to look as if there was something that Jacob could do. I guarantee you, Jacob was having physical relationships with her. It wasn't his fault that she wasn't bearing, and she was totally unjustified in criticizing him over this. And I've said this often, but we aren't just studying something that happened thousands of years ago. Every one of these things has application to us. I have had people in my churches that came to me and they were criticizing their mate because they were looking for that mate to be something to them that only God was intended to be. You know, real quickly, let me just give you an illustration that there was a man who was the son of the First Baptist Church pastor, and he was the captain of the football team and he was buff and he was just awesome. And he married the cheerleader, the sorority leader, and this woman was a Southern belle, and she was just a beautiful woman. I mean, it was Mr. and Mrs. Perfect, and they got married, and you would think that they lived happily ever after. But did you know this couple actually conducted a marriage seminar with me, and this is where I found out all of these things, that the woman, she just expected when she married Mr. Perfect, I mean the guy that everybody wanted, that she was going to have like a fairy tale relationship right off into the sunset, and it was going to be perfect. And he wasn't perfect. Now again, he was better than most. And I know the man, he's now gone on to be with the Lord, but he was an awesome, awesome man, and he loved his wife, but he wasn't everything. She was looking to him to be what only God was meant to be to her. She had physical problems, she had emotional problems, she had struggled with depression, and she just assumed when she married Mr. Perfect that all of these things would leave, and they didn't. And then she felt trapped. Like she was putting demands, expectations on this marriage that she was looking to her husband to do something that only God could supply. God's the only one that could heal her, that could take away her depression. And she actually began to be so resentful towards him that there was so much strife. She threw knives at him. She poured beans over his head. He was the pastor of a large church, and she would turn up the music on Sunday morning as people were coming to church and get out there and just dance and do all of these things to embarrass her husband. And anyway, it's a long story. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but they finally worked it out, and they got their marriage together, and they had a great marriage, and that's the reason that I was having them come and actually conduct a marriage seminar with me. But the problem came because she was placing demands upon her husband that no man could meet. This is exactly what Rachel did. Rachel, instead of turning to the Lord, she came against Jacob and says, you give me children or I'm going to die. I can't live without children. Did you know later we will find that Rachel actually stole the images from her father Laban when they left, and she stole these images, and so she was either an idol worshiper or she was a covetous person, and then she lied to her father about it. We'll read this as we continue to go through this story. And so anyway, my point is Rachel wasn't looking to God. She wasn't a worshiper of the Lord. She may have known about God the way that Laban, her father, did, who had these idols. He was an idol worshiper, but he knew about God, but they weren't true committed people to serving God. And so Rachel at this time wasn't looking to God. She was looking to her husband, and when she couldn't have children, it was all her husband's fault. There was nothing wrong with her husband because Leah, her sister, was producing children. They already had 4 children that were listed in the previous chapter. And so she was looking to Jacob and blaming Jacob for the things that were wrong with her. Boy, there is a lesson in this. You can't look to people. People are not your answer. You know, one of the reasons that there's so many problems in marriage is because people look to each other and they want the person, they marry this person because they think that person is going to make them complete. And it's, in a sense, it's like sticking a straw or something into a cup and just sucking until you hear at the end. And when you get down there and there's nothing left to give and that person is no longer an asset to you, then throw them away and go get you another one. That's kind of the mindset that people have. But marriage is not supposed to be where you just marry this person because they're going to make you complete. But marriage should be where you marry a person because you find somebody that you want to empty yourself into and you want to give and you want to be a blessing to them. It's not about what you can get out of marriage, it's about what you can give. Boy, those potent things that I just said. And you can see that right here. Here she is demanding of Jacob things that he can't give. And she is looking to him instead of looking to God, and it caused problems. In verse 3, it says, and she said, behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I also may have children by her. You know, this is exactly what was done with Sarah and Abraham. She couldn't have children, and so they thought they would help God along, and the whole Arab conflict came out of their flesh, out of their disobedience. And here we see the same thing happening with Rachel and Jacob. And so she's giving her slave, her handmaid, to Jacob to have children, and then she's going to claim that that child will be like her own. And so in verse 4, she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. Dan means judging. So in other words, she felt like she had finally been judged. God was finally judging and working to her benefit. But let me just remind you that, again, she was still an idol worshiper. At this time, was going to later steal these idols, or at the very least, she was a very covetous and liar. She was not really seeking God. You know, it amazes me. If people think really that it's God that doesn't want them to have children, well, then why would they give their handmaid and have children by them? If God doesn't want them to have children, well, then just don't have children. You know, this applies directly to so many things today. The people that are teaching the sovereignty of God, the extreme sovereignty of God, to where God controls everything, and they say God's the one that put sickness on them, God's the one that gave them cancer, God's the one that made their business fail, God's the one that made their marriage fail. They believe that nothing happens but what God wills it. If you really believe that, well, then why would you go to a doctor or take medicine and try and get out of God's will? If God's the one that made you sick, well, then why don't you learn whatever it is He's trying to teach you? If God's the one that made your business to fail, if all of your problems are caused by God, then why do we go and try and take out a loan or do something to, take away the pressure that problem is causing us? It doesn't make sense. Here she is saying that God is the one who did all of these things, and yet this wasn't God. This was just Jacob and Rachel that came up with this plan, and yet they're blaming stuff on God. I tell you, God gets blamed for a lot of stuff that He does not do. In verse 7, it says, "And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali." Did you know, again, the word Naphtali means my wrestling. But she didn't prevail by anybody's standards but her. I mean, even if you looked at it in the natural and thought that this was God's will, that Bilhah become the wife of Jacob and bear him children, and even if you embrace that, which I think it was just totally their own plans, their own way of doing things, she still only had 2 children by Bilhah, whereas Leah had already had 4 sons. So when she says that I've wrestled and prevailed, it's just in her own thinking. This is just showing the frustration, the strife that was going on between them. In verse 9 it says, "And when Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her Jacob to wife." So now Leah starts doing what Rachel had done and takes her servant and gives her to Jacob as wife. So now Jacob is having sexual relationships with 4 different women. 2 wives and 2 concubines, or the handmaidens of his wives. I tell you, this is never, ever, ever the way that God intended things to be. I mentioned this in the previous chapter, but there are some people today who are still promoting polygamy, and yet this is a classic example of why polygamy is not a good thing, because the strife, the division, the hatred of one towards another and stuff, it's illustrated right here. It doesn't work. It will never work. It is not the way that God intended it to be. It was allowed under the Old Testament in Matthew chapter 19 because of the hardness of people's hearts, but it never was the way that God intended it to be. So in verse 10 it says, "And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son, and Leah said, A troop cometh, and she called his name Gad," which the word Gad means a troop, or a troop is coming. And so in other words, she thought that, man, this is just the beginning. There's going to be more children. And she actually was correct. There were more children that she even bore. But this is her again. They're naming these children because of the strife between these sisters. One is named Judging because now Rachel thinks that God is judged and she's on top. And then Leah has her handmaid bear a child and talks about judging or a troop coming and stuff. And it's just reflecting all of the strife that's going on between them. In verse 12, it says, "And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher." And that means happy. And so she was happy now that she had 4 children that she had borne, 2 children that her handmaiden had borne. And in verse 14 it says, "And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest, and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, Is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband, and wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes." You know, this is just amazing to me. And again, this is illustrating all of the problems that come when you have multiple wives. Here they are vying over Jacob and who's going to have sexual relationship with him. You can see from this that apparently because Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah, Rachel was the one that was in charge of who got to have sexual relationships. She was the one in charge. And when she saw that Leah's son had these mandrakes, and you know, I've tried to research this. Some some commentaries say that these mandrakes are some kind of aphrodisiac. I don't understand that. That doesn't make sense to me. And other people think that it is some kind of a food, an animal or something like that. I don't know what it was, but it was something that Rachel wanted enough that she was willing to send Jacob over to have sexual relationships with Leah just so she could get these mandrakes. Again, this shows you a lot about Rachel. It shows you that how carnal she was in so many ways. It shows you that, in a sense, she was willing to prostitute her husband. She bought, she prostituted him. She got what she wanted, these mandrakes from it. And it shows you also things about Leah, that Leah was this hated wife and being rejected. And man, there's just all kinds of problems. There's nothing good that came out of this. Now, God used it to good. He took these 12 sons, and they became the 12 patriarchs, and they were the foundation of all of the tribes. And so God worked it together for good, but this is not the way that God intended things to be. I tell you, there's some lessons to be learned here of what not to do. And in verse 16, and Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, Thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. Again, this is terrible. This is terrible that these two sisters are fighting and, in a sense, paying in order to be able to have sexual relationship and conceive and have children with Jacob. God did not intend this. This was not God's doing. In verse 17, and God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob the 5th son. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I have given my maiden to my husband, and she called his name Issachar. And so Issachar means a hire. Did you know that these names that they gave these kids, man, what a moniker to have to bear your entire life. I don't know if these names came after the fact, but that's just terrible that these children, his name reminded him. Every time somebody asked his name, it reminded him of how he was conceived, that his mother had to hire her own husband from the other wife in order to have a relationship. In verse 19, and Leah conceived again and bare Jacob the 6th son. So Leah had a total of 6 sons. Zilpah, her maid, had 2 sons. Bilhah, which was the maid to Rachel, had 2 sons, and Rachel had 2 sons. So there was a total of 12 sons. In verse 20 it says, and Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons, and she called his name Zebulun, which means dwelling. So here she is. You know, we don't know the exact amount of time. We know that Leah also bare Diana, and so she had 6 sons and 1 daughter, and probably more daughters than that. This is probably over this whole period of time that it's talking about right here. There was a period of 20 years that Jacob served with Laban. And so over this 20-year period of time, she had all of these children, and yet for 20 years, here she is still vying for her husband's attention and her husband's love. And she was rejected. She felt hated. I tell you, this is just a tragic situation on so many levels. In verse 21, and afterwards she bare a daughter and called her name Diana, and that means judgment. And the only reason that the women were ever mentioned was because something prominent happened with them, and we will find this in just a few chapters, where Diana actually causes all of the men in the land of Shechem to be murdered because of her immorality, or her having a sexual relationship with Shechem, the son of the king of that area. And in verse 22 it says, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. And so in the first verse of this chapter, we see that Rachel saying, give me children or else I'll die. And she finally wound up giving her maid to Jacob, and she had 2 children by her maid. But here is the very first child that is born unto Rachel, And I hadn't got time to go through all of this, but if you were to get my living commentary, I go into all of the scriptures and show you this. And Joseph was born when Jacob was, I think it was 91. And so Joseph was the very first child that Rachel bore. She actually wound up having another child, but she died in childbirth, and that child was Benjamin, and that was the last and final son born to Jacob. And so it says in verse 25, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said unto Laban, send me away that I may go into my own place, unto my own country. And so this was 14 years after he had fulfilled those 14 years that he had promised Laban to work for him for his 2 daughters and stuff. He says, send me back to my country. And in verse 26, it says, give me my wives and my children for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. Verse 27, and Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. Now again, this is a point that I made when we were in the previous chapter, but when Jacob first came to Laban, he worked for him for a month on a volunteer basis. And Laban began to see what an industrious person and a hard worker he was. And so he says, appoint me your wages. And that's when he said, I'll work 7 years for Rachel. Laban wound up deceiving him, and he wound up having to serve 14 years in order to get Rachel and Leah. And so here he is, but Laban had seen how he was blessed because of Jacob. Jacob was now the blessed of the Lord. The blessing of Abraham was functioning in him, and everything that he set his hand unto was prospering. And Laban saw it. And so again, this is a recommendation for us doing what we do heartily as unto the Lord and not unto man. And because Jacob had been so diligent and worked so hard, Laban saw this, and he says, now you've got these 2 women, you got my 2 daughters as your wives, but what else can I hire you? What else can I give you so that you'll continue to work for me? And he said, appoint me your wages, and I will give it unto you. And in verse 29, he said unto him, thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me, for it was little which thou hast before I came, and it is now increased unto a multitude. And the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming, and now when shall I provide for my own house also? In other words, Jacob had gotten these 2 wives and their 2 maidens, and so a total of 4 women that he had had children with. They had produced 12 children by this time, or at this time it was actually 11. Benjamin wasn't born yet. But he had wives and children, but he didn't have anything else. He was managing the flocks for Laban. He didn't have his own flocks. And so this is what he's referring to, and he's saying that Jacob by this time had come to a place. This is 14 years after his encounter with the Lord in Genesis chapter 28, and he had come to recognize that it was God that had blessed him. He was now beginning to seek the Lord. Now, he had some other encounters with the Lord where he met these angels, he wrestled with an angel, and he continued to grow in the Lord. But by this time, you can see that he was beginning to have a relationship with the Lord. And when we get into the 31st chapter, I'll make a bigger deal out of this, but when he tells Laban what he wants as his wages, when he's ready to leave, he told his wives it's because of a dream that God had given him, and he saw how God was going to prosper him. So he didn't mention that here in the 30th chapter, but in the 31st chapter he does. And so by this time, he's now in relationship with the Lord, and God is communicating with him, and he now is trusting God to be his source and to be the one who blesses him. And so in verse 31, he said, what shall I give thee? This is Laban speaking unto him. And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. If thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. And so let me just make a point here that this is tremendous. And this shows that Jacob had now moved from where he was really looking to God as his source. Because he had a right to demand that, all right, you give me, I don't know, let's just say 100 sheep per year, 100 goats per year, 100 camels or something. He would have had right to say that and just put down an official wage. But instead, what he did was open it up and say, don't give me anything. Just let me take the cattle and the sheep that have these markings, and I will just keep them. And what he did, he made himself dependent upon God, and God could multiply him beyond just a fixed wage. Here's what I'm trying to illustrate, that, there's nothing wrong with us working for someone and getting a salary. I'm not saying that that's wrong. But you are going to be limited when you work for a salary, limited to that business, to the person that you're working for. It's going to limit your income. If you really want to become, filthy, stinking, dirty rich, did you know you are going to have to get to where you work for yourself and ultimately get to where you take your money and invest it and you let your money work for you? My CEO of my ministry, Billy Epperhart, he's become very successful, multimillionaire in real estate and doing things. And this is one of the things that he teaches all of the time, that you start off working for somebody and you get a salary and you save a small portion of that, but then you start taking these savings and you start investing and you get to where your money is working for you. And this is where real wealth is built. Instead of just Jacob looking to Laban and saying, Laban, give me this and this. In other words, here's my work. You give me this and I'll give you this much work. He says, all I want is just a few of these animals that have these things. And then through selective breeding and through believing God, he was going to see God multiply his assets supernaturally. And sure enough, in the next chapter, you'll find out that God blessed him so much through this method that Laban's own children says that Jacob has stole away all of the wealth of our father, Laban. And so this was something that was awesome. And again, when we get into the 31st chapter, you'll find out that this was because of a dream that he had from God. God communicated this to him, and God gave him this creative way of prospering. Boy, there's a lesson in this, that instead of us just taking whatever comes our way, taking a salary, just working for somebody, you need to listen to God and let God give you creative ideas. Again, I could spend an hour on this, giving you testimonies of people that at one time were struggling and they got hold of this and said, God, you said you'd bless the work of my hand. Give me a creative idea. Show me something. And I can remember this one woman who used to, she would go without food. And Jamie and I used to take food to her. And yet within just a short period of time, she believed God and she had 80 people working for her. Now she's been on Shark Tank and she could have $1 billion worth of income coming just because of some creative ideas. Every single person watching this is that you're just a creative idea, a word from God away from supernatural prosperity. But Jacob, it may look like he just came up with this on his own, but again, in the 31st chapter, it will show you that this was because of a dream. So in verse 32, he says, I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and for such shall be my hire. So shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. Again, this is great wisdom, and I think that this is reflective of the fact that Jacob had now gotten to where he had a relationship with the Lord. He was seeking the Lord, and God was imparting wisdom to him. And this was just great wisdom on his part, because these animal and the markings that they had, any animal that didn't have the markings that he had agreed to, it would be considered stolen. That way there would be no contention, there would be no strife over this. I just think this was great wisdom, and it didn't come from Jacob on his own. Prior to his encounter with the Lord, Jacob was not using much wisdom. I believe that this reflects that he had come a long way in his relationship with the Lord. In verse 34, and Laban said, Behold, I would it might be according to thy word. In other words, here's Laban, who had already taken advantage of Jacob, and he was quite a con man himself. And he just thought this was a great idea because all of the speckled, the spotted, the brown, the ring-staked, all of those were in a huge minority at the time that Jacob was making this contract. And so he thought this is a great deal. But through selective breeding and through Jacob's faith, through the dream that God had given him, God was going to take these spotted animals and multiply them so that they became the dominant. But Laban didn't know that. He was now about to reap what he had sown, and he was going to have it come back on him. You know, I made a big point of this, that Jacob reaped what he had sown when he had taken advantage of his brother and his father, and then Laban took advantage of him and he was reaping that. Well, Laban had also taken advantage of Jacob, and now he's about to reap what he has sown, and he winds up losing all of his assets, all of his cattle, everything began to start being these marked animals. And so again, it goes back to Galatians chapter 6 that you reap what you sow. In verse 35, and he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave it unto them into the hand of his son. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. And so here was a physical separation, 3 days' journey between them, and so there was no interaction between his animals and Laban's animals. And in verse 37, and Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and piled white strakes in them, and made white appear which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had piled before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks towards the ring-straked, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's cattle. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's. And the man increased exceedingly, and he had much cattle, and maidservants, and men servants, and camels, and asses. And so what this is all doing, some people have taken this and think that somehow or another this is witchcraft, this is some kind of casting spells and things like that. The Bible does not support that. I do not believe that this is what it is at all. I believe part of this was because, and again, when we get into the 31st chapter, you will see that God gave Jacob a dream that this was going to happen. And so this was a word from God, and I believe that at least part of him taking all of these sticks and piling them and putting these, peeling the bark off and doing these things, a lot of it was for Jacob to keep this vision in front of him. He had something physical that he was doing that kept this vision that God had given him in a dream. I think it's Genesis chapter 31, verse 10, but we will get to that in the next chapter. It was doing this to keep this vision in front of him. You know, I can say these same things, that God has given me a vision about building out our Charis Bible College and things, and I have had architects put up renderings of the buildings that we're going to build, and I have television screens all over our different facilities, and they are constantly playing this so that this vision is in front of me and it's in front of all our employees. And so I can understand that this is important. It also, now this is a little strange, but I believe it also influenced the animals. That's what it looks like when you read these things. It says when they came to conceive that he would put these sticks before them that he had peeled the bark off. And so I believe it could have affected the imagination of these animals too. Now I certainly can't verify that, but you can't disprove it. Anyway, somehow or another, whether it was just symbolic or whether they actually did anything to these animals, he was practicing selective breeding. he had all of his animals that had these special markings separated by 3 days, and he was also tending Laban's flocks. And so every time that he saw an animal that had a potential for this, he would put these sticks in front of them, and when they would conceive, he would take all of the spotted and ring-straked and things, and he would separate them and put them with him. And so through this selective breeding program, he basically took all of the animals and they began to start bearing these special markings. And so the stronger animals became Jacob's, and also the majority of the animals began to start having these marks. And because of it, he had basically just taken away all of the animals of Laban, and it was according to the contract that they had. Every one of those animals had these markings that he couldn't complain about it. And so Jacob began to start taking advantage of Laban now. Laban was beginning to reap what he had sown. And so as we get into the next chapter, this will talk about the conflict that came and how Jacob and his family had to flee. And then ultimately this leads to his special encounter with the angels of God, and then a specific angel where he wrestles with him. And this is when Jacob's life really begins to start being given over to the Lord. And so Jacob has changed. And during this period of time, he had served 14 years for Rachel and Leah. Then he served an additional, he was going to serve for 7 years, but in the 6th year, he began to see that Laban was so upset with him because all of the animals were beginning to now have these special markings, and he had lost his flock, that he fled and he didn't fulfill the full 7 years. So anyway, what we've covered in Jacob's life up until this time is 20 years with Laban. He was 77 when he came to Laban, so he's now 97 at this time that chapter 31 is going to begin. So we've now come to the end of Genesis chapter 30, and we will now continue in 31, and let me see how many chapters we've got left. I now have only 1,159 chapters to go in our study through the Bible.